Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Biology Podcast with Mr. Zabel. In today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at is a light reaction. We're going to also explore the components of the dark reaction, and we're going to see how they are both important in the process of photosynthesis. So if you can remember back to our last lesson when we talked about the structure of a leaf, we basically looked at a leaf and then we broke it apart and looked at the different components that made up our leaf structure. And so what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into that leaf and we're going to zoom into a chloroplast. So here's our chloroplast. So if you can think back to our last biology podcast, we went over the chloroplast and went over the specific structures that were really unique to chloroplast and aided in its function. And so if you can remember, we had what's called a thylakoid, and so that's these individual like quarters or pancakes we called them. But a thylakoid on it has this little tiny membrane. This little tiny dark line right here represents a thylakoid membrane. And it's on this thylakoid membrane where we have the light reaction take place. And so let's take a look and zoom into this thylakoid membrane. So here we are zoomed into our thylakoid membrane. And as you can see, we have a thylakoid membrane here, a thylakoid space, and then a thylakoid membrane. And so it's just like we were saying is how we have these stacks of quarters, and then that dark line represented our thylakoid membrane. And so this is going to be very important because it's at this location where we begin the light reaction. And so we call it the light reaction because in order to initiate it, we need the light or the sun source to activate it. And so when we look at it, the two main goals of the light reaction is to produce NADPH and ATP, which are two types of energy sources. And so this is like a fully charged battery. And remember, before we have ATP, it's ADP, and before we have NADPH, it's NADP+. So we're trying to convert these half-charged batteries to fully charged batteries because it's these two types of energies that will be used to trigger our dark reaction. So let's talk about how this whole light reaction works. Well, the first thing, like I said, it's called the light reaction because it needs sunlight. And so we're going to have sunlight that's going to come in contact with our photosystem 2. And so our photosystem 2 is going to have a whole bunch of pigments or chlorophyll that's going to be located on here. And so it's going to basically, if you remember, it's going to help absorb that sunlight. So the sunlight will be absorbed, and as it does that, it's going to get these electrons all excited, and they're going to travel. So as these electrons get hit with the sunlight, they're going to get excited, and they're going to move across photosystem 2 and then go across this complex. Okay, so here's these excited electrons, they're moving across, and they're getting excited, moving to the next complex. As they move to this complex, we're going to have hydrogen ions that will then make their way through, and it's the energy of the electrons passing through that will pull them down. And so, again, these electrons will pass through, hydrogen ions will then go through the complex, and as you can see, we're going to get a high concentration of hydrogen in the thylakoid space. So we want to have a high concentration here of hydrogen ions in our thylakoid space. And I'll talk a little more about that when we get to it. But as these electrons make their way through this electron transport chain, we are going to then have them go through photosystem 1. And it's through this photosystem 1 that once they pass through it, they charge up NADP plus into NADPH. So remember, before we can turn it to NADPH, we have NADP plus, our half-charged battery. So NADP plus turns into NADPH through the passing of these electrons that get it excited, and they basically charge up that energy. And so we have a fully charged battery, and so we have created now NADPH, which is our main energy that we want to start with. Okay? Another thing that we're going to be doing is we need water to add to our plants. So we're going to put in water, and I'll do 2 water molecules, and you'll see why here in a little bit. But we have water that will get into our thylakoid space, and that will then break apart. And the reason I did 2 is because we need 2 oxygens. These 2 oxygens will be released, and as they're released, if we have O2, we release oxygen. So this is the plant's way of releasing oxygen that you and I can breathe in. Okay, so we're going to have 2 water molecules. For every 2 molecules, we'll produce an oxygen molecule. And then we're going to have 4 hydrogen ions, and as you can see, here's our 4 hydrogen ions. They are going to be produced, and so we're going to have even more hydrogen ions that will be passed through into our thylakoid space. Now the question is, why do we have all these hydrogen ions in our thylakoid space? Why are we trying to get this high concentration in there? Well, the reason we want to do that is because now we can initiate a process called chemiosmosis. And so in chemiosmosis, these hydrogen ions will start to move and migrate to this synthase, this ATP synthase. And so as they do, the hydrogen ions will then pass through ATP synthase, and they are going to change ADP, add another phosphate to it, and turn to ATP. Okay, so we're going to make a ton of ATP energy molecules. And so as we do this, we are going to create ATP and we are going to create NADPH. This is going to consistently be producing ATP and NADPH. And so it's this process that will then trigger our dark reaction. So if you take a look at the link down below, you're going to see an animation of our light reaction. So take a look, review that, and hopefully that will give you a better sense of how this works in an animated view. So let's take a look here at another illustration to help you understand how this light reaction works. So let's recap what we've been talking about. Remember, we first said that in our light reaction, we need the process of the sun. We need the energy from it. So it's going to basically send its sun rays down, and those sun rays are going to travel until they reach our chloroplast. And then on our chloroplast, we're going to have our thylakoid membrane. And then on that thylakoid membrane, we're going to have photosystem II that has a ton of different chlorophyll that will basically help absorb that sunlight. And then as that sunlight is being absorbed, it's going to have a whole bunch of electrons that will get excited that will then start to move and then migrate along this electron transport chain. We'll then have hydrogen ions that will pass down and go through a complex to go to that thylakoid space. And then they'll sit in there until they go to ATP synthase. And then we're going to also have those electrons that will then start to move through photosystem I. And then as they do that, they're going to help produce NADPH. So again, we're going to have NADP plus turn into NADPH, so we make that one fully charged battery here. We're also going to have water that's going to come in contact with our thylakoid membrane, and it's going to then move to the thylakoid space where we'll have the hydrogen ions. They'll break apart, so we'll have 4 hydrogen ions that will stay in that thylakoid space, and then we'll have 2 oxygen molecules that will produce O2, and so that will be released, and that's what we breathe in. And then as we have this accumulation of high concentration of hydrogen ions in the inside of our thylakoid space, that will then migrate to our ATP synthase and create ATP. So we made these 2 energy sources in our light reaction. What we're going to get into next then is our dark reaction or Calvin cycle. And the good thing about the dark reaction is you don't have to, it's a really complicated step, and it's just a series of reactions that kind of repeat themselves. So we're not going to have you memorize it, but I do want you to know that you need ATP and NADPH to trigger our dark reaction. I also want you to know that in our dark reaction, we're going to have CO2. Again, this is what the plant's taking in because you're breathing it out. CO2 will then come in, and that will be a thing that's going to be necessary to begin our dark reaction. So the dark reaction needs CO2, it needs ATP and NADPH, and then it can start to make a product called the sugar of glucose. So those are the main things that I want you to know, is that we have ATP, NADPH, CO2 that are coming in the dark reaction, and then they are making a sugar called glucose. As this dark reaction is being used up, it's going to use this energy. So we're going to then use that fully charged battery up. It's going to turn into a half-charged battery, and we're going to bring it back to NADP plus and ADP. So we're going to bring these fully charged batteries back down to a half-charged battery, and then the process starts all over again. We're going to need to have this light reaction to recharge up the batteries. They're going to be used up, and then they'll just keep repeating this cycle over and over, going from light to dark reaction. And so I just want to make sure this is clear too. When we talk about the dark reaction it can still work in the presence of light and the absence of light. It just needs the light reaction to produce the energy to trigger it, and that's why we call it the dark reaction. Alright, so now what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want to see what you can tell me about this diagram, this picture right here of our light reaction and our Calvin cycle or dark reaction. Can you fully explain what we've been talking about? And so basically what I want you to do is, can you go through and tell me what are the reactants of the light reaction, what are the reactants of the Calvin cycle, and then what are the products that are also produced in the light reaction and the dark reaction or Calvin cycle. So I hope this was a helpful podcast. Again, if you're still confused, that's fine. Come see me so I can help you. And then make sure you also check the links down below, because there's a lot of good animations that will basically illustrate how the light reaction and the dark reaction and the Calvin cycle work together. So again, if you have any questions, come see me so I can help you with it. But we'll be going through this in class. But until next time, remember, keep studying biology.